So, thank you all so much for coming to my Vel Phillips presentation. Thank you all again, and happy Black History Month. So, Vel Phillips almost needs no introduction. She is one of the most influential, important people in Milwaukee history. She's one of those people to where the more I study her, just the bigger fan I am of her. I could do 10 presentations on Vel Phillips and I'd still feel like I didn't get enough in. So definitely an amazing woman. So here's how I'm going to structure this. I'm going to look at Vel Phillips really in her own words. I'm going to be leaning heavily on some interviews she did. One was for Marquette, one was for a JFK archive. Another was something she did kind of around. So, like I said, so I'm going to kind of string together these interviews, try to create a story from them. And we are going to finish with a radio talk she gave in 1967. I'll explain it when it gets a little closer to time, but after reading it, I thought this would be the perfect way to end. Okay, so Vel Phillips was born Velvea Hortense Phillips Rogers on February 18th, 1923 in Milwaukee. So her birthday's coming up. I think it is either next Sunday. Is today the 11th? Yes. Okay, so it would be next Sunday. So again, born in Milwaukee. She went to Milwaukee's North Division High School. It was mainly white high school. But what she's famous for there is winning a speech contest. And it's very interesting how the speech contest came about. So Vel Phillips explains, I had been thinking about entering the oratorical contest, which is a national contest. And I thought I could get a little practice by doing our high school thing. So I got going to Miss Moonslater, who was in charge of the forensic contest. She was very racist. There were speeches that were already written, and you were supposed to memorize them. They had a whole slew of them. So you were supposed to just say, I want the oration, any oration. But when I asked for the orations, she said to me, all the orations are out. So another teacher, Miss Roberts, needed to intervene to allow her to enter this contest at all. So she continues, Miss Roberts told my sister, I'd like to speak to Velvea. She said, listen, are you writing a speech for the Elk Oratorical Contest? I said, yes. She said, well, why don't you just march in and tell her that you don't need any of her speeches, that it's going to be an original oration. So I said, I can't do that. This was written for, the politically correct term at the time was Negroes. So I said, this is written for Negroes and for the Black Elks. Miss Roberts, she said, well, that doesn't make any difference. Vel, you wrote it yourself. Velvela, you wrote it yourself. Just go in and do it. If you're afraid to do it. I was very shy. She said, I'll tell her. Because the two of them, Miss Moonslater and Miss Roberts, were in charge of the oratorical of the forensic contest. So the teacher who helped her and the teacher standing in her way were both the judges. So according to the teacher, she did not win the contest. From what I understand, there was a contest and there were 4 finalists, and the finalists moved on. And she was not initially one of the 4 finalists. But she continues that her sister said, Vel, something is going on at this school. Do you know what it is? I haven't found out, but I keep hearing them say your name. What's going on? Have you done something? I said, no, I haven't done anything. She said, well, how did the contest turn out? I said, well, I didn't make it, you know. She said, I think that's what they're talking about. Well, to make a long story short, the students thought that I gave the best speech and that I should not be eliminated. So they passed around this petition saying that Vel, not Vel Phillips, because it was Valia Rogers, was the best one and she was eliminated. And that was not right. And this and that. So they actually had her go in as a 5th entry. And she won the contest and got a scholarship to the school of her choice. So it was interesting. She talks about feeling a little bad, like, did she take somebody else's spot? But the runner-up said, no, you won that contest. You know, you deserved to win that contest. So once she won the scholarship, she chose Howard University. She chose it because she wanted a more historically black university. And although her mother initially refused, she relented provided 3 conditions were met. Phillips claims her mother said, I know you want to go to Howard because I had met a Miss Young at the Urban League who had just graduated from Howard, and she was talking about how wonderful it was. So my mother said to me, there's 3 rules. If you follow these 3 rules, I will let you go to Howard University. These 3 rules, I really think, shaped my life. She said, there will be no smoking of any kind until you graduate. Now, she wasn't talking about drugs. She's talking about camels and Chesterfields and like that. Well, I hadn't smoked, so that didn't seem difficult. I didn't know that I'd be tempted. And then she said, there will be no alcohol, beer, or anything like that until then I could finish it because I knew you graduate. And I said, fine. I didn't drink anything, so that didn't seem to be a problem. I didn't know that they would have wild parties in the dorm and there would be all kinds of alcoholic beverages and that I'd even be tempted. So I said, fine. Then she said, and you must remain a sweet girl.
We know what that means.
And then I finished it. I said, until I graduate. She said, nope. Until you marry, you must remain a sweet girl. So I said, fine. And trust me, I wish this was a written interview and I wish I could have heard her live. That had to be good. So she followed these 3 rules. She actually talks about in another place how even as a member of the Common Council, she didn't drink. And she said it kind of made her special, you know, and she seemed to sometimes have the clearer head of everybody. So it probably played a role. So she never smoked, to my knowledge, either. So she did ultimately get married. But first she went to the University of Wisconsin for a law degree. That's where she met her husband, Vel Phillips. She states, so when I did meet my husband, although I did not want to marry at all, we had 2 dates. Then we ran off and got married. 2 dates. Went to Dubuque, Iowa, and didn't tell my mother.
All it took was 2 days?
They were married until his death. Yeah, I didn't quite get the exact number of how many years they were married. I think it was in the 50s.
And he was white?
No, he was black.
Okay.
He was black.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, yeah, so I did find the love of her life.
Yeah.
So in addition, she actually, into racism, she actually faced quite a bit of sexism too.
Yeah.
So she continues, when I was in law school, my husband and I would be together and they'd say to him, oh, aren't you lucky? You've got a built-in secretary. And I would be just fuming. Why should I be his secretary when I'm going through the same school? They were going through law school together.
Yeah.
And so my husband would sort of kick me like, keep cool. Because I wanted to say, are you kidding? Maybe he'll be my secretary. So, unfortunately, she faced that. But her and her husband were the first black couple to graduate from the University of Wisconsin-Madison Law School.
Yeah.
So,
What year was that?
sometime in the 50s. I didn't quite get the year, so sorry. So they returned to Milwaukee, where Vel Phillips became a member of the Common Council. And once again, the story of how this happened is quite interesting. So initially, her husband was the one that was asked to join the Common Council. They had just made a new district, so they're looking for somebody to represent it. But her husband wasn't very interested. So she says he didn't want to run. He just said that it wasn't his pot of tea. I'll do anything, I said. I don't know what I should really do. So I called Doyle Getter at the Journal, who had written the story when we had been admitted to the bar. I said, would you tell me how many women have been on the council? Can you check your records? He said, oh, sure. So he called me back and said, no woman has ever served. No woman has ever even survived the primary. Why do you ask? I said, Dale is reneging now, and he's trying to get me to run in order for me to stop nagging him to run. So he said, you wouldn't want to do it, Belle. You're so feminine and so little and petite.
Boy.
And there's all that smoke and just a lot of men sitting around. But the more he downed it, the more he played it down, the more interested I got. So Vel Phillips ran, and she became not just the first black woman, but the first woman to be elected to the Common Council. So after spending a few years getting used to the position, she got to work introducing her own bills. So I actually did a present last year on her most famous bill, so we'll get into that a little bit. But according to UWM March on Milwaukee, in 1962, she introduced the Phillips Housing Ordinance, a bill that outlawed housing discrimination to her peers in the Common Council. The bill, however, was defeated 18-1 with only her vote in favor. Between the years of 1963 and 1967, Phillips would reintroduce the Fair Housing Bill 3 additional times, only to have it defeated each time. So, never gave up on that bill. But she also did fight, and she encouraged others to do so as well, including Hank Aaron. So according to James E. Causey out of Slate magazine, one of his mentors was Vel Phillips, a small woman, but a giant in Milwaukee's fair housing and civil rights movements. Phillips and her husband, Dale, took Aaron under their wings, mentoring him on Milwaukee's history and civil rights at their home on Summit Avenue by Lafayette Hill on the north side. The house had previously belonged to Milwaukee Mayor Henry Meyer, who frequently clashed with Phillips. Phillips educated Aaron on the racially restrictive covenants that excluded black families from residential areas in the city. Similar discriminatory laws instituted to halt school desegregation and subvert open housing policies expanded to Milwaukee's suburbs. Phillips instructed Aaron on how to use his star power, the civil rights movement, and to fight against those practices. So it wasn't just somebody who fought, but somebody who recruited others. She was also involved in national politics, including the campaign of John F. Kennedy. So how her and Kennedy met is very interesting. The things actually really weren't smooth between them the first time they met. Shortly after he began his campaign for presidency, JFK held an interview, and Vel Phillips was one guest. So he took the time to talk to all his guests. I think it was kind of a smallish luncheon. But Vel Phillips states, I turned to him and said, "You know, I have been a great fan of yours, and I was extremely disappointed that you did not get the vice presidential nomination. But I might as well tell you frankly, I was very disappointed at your vote on the jury trial amendment. I just couldn't understand it. I didn't like it." And there were so many people around, and he said, "Oh, Mrs. Phillips," because he remembered he had to have these names before him when he got up and addressed the group. So he said, "Well, Mrs. Phillips, if you have a moment, I'd like to explain that to you." So I said, "Well, yes, I'll take a moment." So we went away, sort of stepped aside there at the hotel. We must have sat there for all 15 minutes, I think. And people were rushing about, and they were telling him the plane had to go, and different things like that. And with all that hustle and bustle, he sat down, and he never tried to make any excuse for doing what he did, or fix it up in any way. He just told me openly and politely that he had taken the advice of, and he named the people at the time, and that they were Harvard professors, that he did not have a great deal of experience the whole minority problem, but he was learning, and that, quite frankly, he did have to go on the advice given to him by others. And if he had erred, it was in this way. And I'll be very honest with you, he was so forthright and so sincere in his statement that it really wouldn't have mattered much, almost, what he said. He said precisely what was, and he said he would try never again to have to depend on others to advise him in this area. He hoped, by his own experience, he would be able to come up with the right answers and that sort of thing. So I thought, well, what can you say when someone is that forthright? So then we parted, and after that, he sent me a little note, which I still have, and we became kind of friends. This was, say, like in the fall, I would imagine, or summer. And Vel Phillips actually did help him in his campaign when he campaigned in Milwaukee. So they met a few more times before he was assassinated. So Vel Phillips is really famous mostly, though, for the fair housing marches in Milwaukee. Now, again, I did a presentation on this last year. I think I uploaded it to YouTube. I know it's on the parish Facebook page. If you want a link or you're having trouble getting to it, just shoot me an email or something. So that's why I'm going to skip through a lot of this, because I don't want to give the same presentation twice. But I'll hit the highlights. So really, in short, it's the NAACP met up with a priest named Father John Groppi. It was a Roman Catholic priest, and he was working with a predominantly black parish, heard their problems, and decided to march for fair housing. So he wanted to go down the 16th Street Viaduct. You know what that is? It's between Marquette University and the neighborhood to the south.
Yeah.
So that's the 16th Street Viaduct. I think it's now named for Father Groppi. So again, he wanted Vel Phillips to join him, and Vel Phillips agreed to do it. But she had to wait a night. So she states, soon as I came home from City Hall, the first day, they called me and said, would you like to march? As soon as he asked me if he could join my cause, and I said, yes. Then I called Jimmy Pierce. Then Jimmy Pierce called and said, we're getting ready to go. Would you like to go? I had taken off my clothes, my City Hall clothes, and was already in my lounge stuff. And I said, yes, but I'm all undone. So he said, well, we'll wait for you. So I was downstairs, my husband was there, and my two boys were playing chess. My husband heard me, so I said, listen, I won't be long. We were marching across the bridge. So I ran upstairs and got dressed real quick. When I came down, my husband was not there. So I said to the boys, where's your father? So Michael, one of her sons, finally said to one of them, I think he may have gone to filling station down at the corner, Mom, to get some cigarettes. So I waited and I waited and I waited. And then finally I called my mother to ask if she would come over so I could go march for the first time. And so she said, oh, Dale didn't tell you? She loved my husband so much. At first she was not too fond of him. She thought he was kind of streetwise, but then later on she learned to love him a lot. So she said, he's on his way over here. That's when she said, because he doesn't think you should march with Groppy. And I said, Mom, and she said, and I agreed with him, I think it's very unladylike, running up and down the street, shouting and screaming. I said, Mom, I won't be doing that. I'll be marching for my housing bill. So I missed that first night, as I explained to you last week. And thereafter, I never missed one night. It was the most beautiful, beautiful thing. I'll say this. So she did march every night, and this march went on for months.
And it was violent.
Yes.
That's what I thought you were
It was
gonna say.
violent. It might have been beautiful, but she's couching it.
Yeah, I'd like to think she's talking about the spirit of the marchers and not the spirit of the counter-protesters. Because there were, I cannot repeat a lot of what they said on air. Yes, feces, urine thrown at them, other objects, horrendous. But they kept marching. So, according to UWM, she was also arrested a few days later for allegedly violating Mayor Meyer's 30-day ban on marches and demonstrations. So she actually was arrested for her role in all this. So the protesters marched for months until the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. That was the thing that got the federal government to sign the Fair Housing Bill. And Milwaukee soon passed Phillips' bill as well. So, but Vel Phillips was not done with civil rights. According to UWM, the Youth Council once again teamed up with Vel Phillips for its 1968 campaign against the Allen Bradley Company's discriminatory hiring policy. Although she did not march in the campaign, Phillips did assist the Youth Council in negotiating with the company's officials and representatives. Okay, so really, to make a really long story short, the Allen Bradley Company was not hiring minority members, at least not on the scale they were hiring white workers. So the Black and Hispanic communities united together to march against these unfair hiring practices. And that's really could be its own presentation, and maybe we'll do that next year. I always get inspiration from these things. So she's still not done being the first to do things. According to UWM, a few years later, in 1971, Governor Patrick Lucey appointed Phillips to the Milwaukee County Circuit Court, making her Wisconsin's first African-American judge. In 1978, she once again made history. She became the first African-American to be elected as Secretary of State. So, a woman of first, I was hearing some interviews people gave where she was actually kind of upset about being the first to do these things because she thought they should have been done all along, that others should have been able to do it. But even through all this, she never lost a heart for others. And this is what I think kind of the cool part of her witness is. She explains, when Groppy was very ill, I would go to the hospital. I think it was cancer that he had. I would go to visit him in the hospital, and I would go at feeding time because he had to have nurses feed him. He couldn't feed himself. So I found that out. So I would go in time and feed him. I was glad to do it because I just loved him. But I would always come back feeling so badly because he couldn't say thank you. He couldn't talk at all, but he would look at me, and his eyes, as I live and breathe, his eyes said, I love you. His eyes said, thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for feeding me. Thank you so much for just being you. His eyes said it all, and I'll never forget it. So I did the same thing for John Reynolds. The judge, John Reynolds' first wife, Patty Reynolds, was sick. It touched me so much how Groppy was ill that Patty Reynolds, John Reynolds, and his wife now are dead. When she was in the hospital, I would do the same with her. It's the most rewarding thing to see, especially if they can't talk. So her life of service ended on April 17th, 2018, which a life very well lived. So I kind of want to end it. I alluded the announcement to a radio show. And Vel Phillips in the 60s, sometimes a radio segment, sometimes an entire show, would discuss issues of the day, talk a little bit about Black history, and would do some reflections. And we often talk about witnesses, witness, and actions, and that's very important. And certainly her actions witnessed a very full life. But I want her words to witness as well, because I think she gives us things to think about. So, this reflection is quite timely because Episcopalians, Catholics, Lutherans, we're heading into the season of Lent this Wednesday. So I think it's important for us to think about what Lent is, to see Lent from another perspective. So this radio segment is entitled The Meaning of Jesus to Black Slaves. And because I just got to finish things a certain way, I, as a narrator, am going to sign off and say live and love. And now I'm going to let Vel Phillips' words end us. By the way, this radio program is on the Wisconsin Historical Society. You can find it online. If you ever had a chance to listen to it, do so. I'm just terrible at messing with computers, so I'm going to read it. Yes.
I just wanted to share one observation. You talked about her, she and Mayor Meyer not being on the same page. Her good friend, Frank Zeidler, who was mayor from 1940 to 40 to 58. And they were very, very good friends. And in fact, she got involved with Lutheran Human Relations Association through Frank Zeidler, who sat on that board. And she was just a beautiful speaker. She was so motivating. She was so. I sat on the same board with Frank, so I got to know her. And what a wonderful, wonderful human being.
Yes, she was amazing, a beautiful speaker, and all I can do is hope I do this justice. So, the meaning of Jesus to Black slaves. Here's Vel Phillips. In the early days of Christianity, all of Easter week was one continuous feast. Gradually, the church reduced obligatory attendance to days to 4 and 3, then 2. However, Easter Monday in medieval times was extremely important. And today, in many countries of Europe, it still remains that day of rest, relaxation, special festivities. During the Christmas season, I deviated from the usual subject matter and talked a bit about the Negro spiritual and its relationship to the birth of Christ. I would like now to again deviate, and on this Easter Monday, speak briefly about the spiritual and its relationship to the death of Christ. We all love the spiritual for its death, its simplicity, its humility, its joy, its inner beauty, and its historical meaning. Most of the Negro spirituals, or at least most of the well-known ones, were sorrow songs that expressed the slaves' loneliness, his fears, his heavy burden, and his joy in the world beyond. Actually, as was the case in the birth of Christ, not too many spirituals deal directly with the death of Christ. However, those that do seem to be extreme, I said, and deeply emotional. Perhaps because the death of Jesus took on a deep and personal poignancy with the slaves. It was not merely the death of a man or God. There was in it a quality of identification and experience that somehow continued to burn its way deep into the heart of even the most emotional. It was evident the suffering of Jesus on the cross was something more to the slave. As Jesus suffered and died, the slave was with him. They identified in that they felt that they knew what he suffered. It was a cry of the heart that found a response and an echo in their own. They entered into the fellowship of his suffering. And there was something universal that reached all levels of society and encompassed in its sweep the entire human race. The most universally beloved of all the hymns about Jesus and the crucifixion is the well-known, "Were You There?" When they crucified my Lord. Interestingly enough, many years ago, when a group of Negroes from the United States visited Mahatma Gandhi, it was this song that he requested and sang. This illustrates, I think, more than anything else, how the Negro spiritual cuts across differences of religion, race, class, language, and dares to affirm that the key to the mystery of a cross is found within the heart of the experience itself. "Were You There?" is a dramatic and emotional song of the Spirit that leaves no one untouched. There are 5 verses, but the first verse gives the key to the remaining 4. "Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble. Were you there when they crucified my Lord?" Then the second verse, "Were you there when they nailed him to the tree?" It becomes increasingly more sad and more dramatic. "Were you there when they pierced him in the side? And were you there when the sun refused to shine?" And finally, "Were you there when they laid him in the tomb?" The inferences, plain and clear. The slave is saying that he was there and he knew what he went through. Because the slaves had met him in the high traces of pain and claimed him as his brother. Another spiritual about the resurrection that is equally beloved is, "See how they done my Lord." Perhaps you will recognize it. "See how they done my Lord. See how they done my Lord. See how they done my Lord." And he never said a mumbling word. "See how they done my Lord." And he never said a mumbling word. Not a word, not a word, not a word. The second verse, "They judged him all night long. They judged him all night long, all night long. They judged him all night long." And he never said a mumbling word. And he never said a mumbling word. Not a word, not a word, not a word. And again, the succeeding stanzas become more and more poignant and expressive. "They led him from the court." The 4th paragraph, "They whipped him all night long. And then they nailed him to the tree. Do you hear how the hammer rang?" And finally, "Wasn't that an awful shame?" And of course it would continue like the first one. "Wasn't that an awful shame? Wasn't that an awful shame? Wasn't that an awful shame. And he never said a mumbling word. And he never said a mumbling word. Not a word, not a word, not a word. Yes, the Negro spiritual stands alone because of its depth. It's interesting to see some bonus. It's your joy, its inner beauty, and its historical meaning. That's all the time we have for today. Goodbye for now, and thank you for listening.
Wow.